On February 18, 1922, St. Margaret's Westminster filled with 2,000 guests who had come to witness what the newspapers called the wedding of the year. Edwina Ashley, 20 years old, descended from her grandfather's fortune, walked toward Louis Mountbatten, a naval officer descended from European royalty but carrying almost nothing else. The ceremony cost what a factory worker might earn in 15 years. Outside, a crowd pressed against police barriers to glimpse the bride's entrance. Inside, the air smelled of forced hothouse lilies in the dead of winter. What no one mentioned in the coverage was how young she looked, or how carefully Louis had calculated the financial advantage, or that her grandfather's money, Wasage, built on banking, speculation, and lending, had purchased exactly this: proximity to bloodlines that would never have received him. The marriage joined old titles to new wealth, but it did not join two people. It joined two kinds of loneliness that would spend decades failing to recognize each other. This is not a story about a woman who broke free. It is a story about what she ran toward when she discovered that everything she had been given was not enough, and what she destroyed in the running. It begins, as these things often do, with a fortune that arrived too late and a child who learned early that love and inheritance are not the same thing. Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley entered the world on November 28, 1901, in a house that did not belong to her parents. Her father, Wilfred Ashley, was the younger son of a minor aristocratic family, with land but no money. Her mother, Maud Castle, was the only child of Ernest Castle, a German-Jewish banker who had arrived in England with almost nothing and built a fortune so vast that even King Edward VII borrowed from him. The marriage between Wilfred and Maud was what polite society called advantageous. Wilfred acquired financial security, and Cassell acquired the possibility that his daughter's children might be received where he never quite was. Ernest Cassell was a man who understood numbers with absolute clarity and human acceptance not at all. He had converted to Catholicism, donated to churches, funded hospitals, and built a mansion on Park Lane designed to look as English as possible. None of it erased the whispers. In drawing rooms across Mayfair, people accepted his invitations, borrowed his money, and never let him forget that his presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. He knew this. He also knew that Edwina, with her mother's beauty and her father's bloodline, might accomplish what he could not. The plan required Maud to live long enough to raise the child into that world. She did not. When Edwina was 10 years old, her mother contracted tuberculosis following the birth of her younger sister, Mary. The illness progressed slowly, then quickly. Maud spent months in Swiss sanatoria, writing letters home that arrived with increasing gaps between them. She died in 1911, and Edwina learned about it the way children of that class learned about most important things. From a headmistress at boarding school in an office that smelled of floor wax, told to collect her things without crying in front of the other girls. Wilfred Ashley remarried within 2 years. His new wife was younger, more social, less interested in his daughters. Edwina and Mary were not mistreated in any obvious way. They were simply relocated to schools during term time, to their grandfather's house during holidays, to the margins of their father's new domestic arrangements. Wilfred was not cruel. He was absent in the particular way that men of his generation were absent, assuming that providing food, clothing, and education fulfilled the requirements of fatherhood. Emotional attention was something other people were paid to supply. Edwina's grandfather became the center of her world by default rather than affection. Ernest Cassell was 70 years old, increasingly ill, and had never been warm even in health. He did not know how to speak to children, but he gave her things: a room in his Park Lane mansion, an allowance, introductions to people who mattered. He took her to the opera not because she enjoyed it, but because she should be seen there. He corrected her posture, her pronunciation, her choice of friends. He was building something, and she was the material. She learned quickly what was expected. At 12, she was already beautiful in a way that made adults stop talking when she entered a room. By 15, she had learned to use the silence, how to smile in a manner that suggested depth without requiring her to reveal anything true, how to ask questions that made important men feel intelligent, how to dress expensively without appearing to have thought about it. These were not skills anyone taught explicitly. They were absorbed through observation. the way children in other homes learn to clean fish or milk cows. Her education was stitched together from different schools, the Links in Eastbourne, a finishing school in Paris. She learned French, passable German, how to manage household accounts, and nothing that would prepare her for work. Work was not the purpose. The purpose was marriageability, which required fluency in conversation, adequate piano skills, and the ability to oversee staff without making them hate you. She was good at languages and bored by everything else. Her letters from school were polite, brief, and revealed nothing. She signed them, "Your affectionate granddaughter." But there was no evidence of affection in either direction, only transaction. Only. In 1919, Ernest Cassell suffered the first of several heart attacks. He survived, but began arranging his affairs with the precision he had always applied to finance. His will was explicit. Edwina would inherit the majority of his fortune when she turned 21 or when she married, whichever came first. Mary would receive less. The terms were clear and coldly practical. He was investing in Edwina's social potential, not distributing love equally among grandchildren. The number was £2 million. In contemporary terms, it represented generational wealth, the kind that purchased not just comfort, but position. Edwina, at 17, became one of the most eligible women in England, not because of who she was, but because of what she would soon legally possess. Invitations arrived in stacks. Young men who had never noticed her suddenly appeared at the same parties. Mothers who had been coolly polite began requesting her presence at country weekends. She was not naive about what was happening. She had spent her entire childhood watching transactions disguised as relationships. Her grandfather's friendships were built on lending. Her father's second marriage was built on youth and availability. Her own worth had been calculated and announced in pounds sterling before she was old enough to understand what any of it meant. The attention she received after the will became known was not flattering. It was clarifying. She responded the way she had learned to respond to everything, by performing competence while revealing nothing. She accepted invitations, danced adequately, laughed at appropriate moments. She watched other girls her age fall genuinely in love with men who had no money and saw their parents intervene with swift brutality. She learned that love, if it existed at all, was something that happened to other people in other circumstances. For someone carrying £2 million into adulthood, love was a luxury she could not afford. In 1920, Ernest Cassell's health worsened again. He stopped going to his office, then stopped leaving his bedroom. Edwina visited dutifully, sitting beside a man who had shaped her entire existence, but never once asked what she wanted from life. He died in September 1921, and she inherited everything he had promised. She was 19 years old, extraordinarily wealthy, and had never made a single decision that was entirely her own. The fortune arrived with no instructions, except the ones that had been implicit all along. Marry well, marry appropriately, marry someone whose name would justify everything her grandfather had built. She had 1 year before suitors would begin calculating whether her beauty and money were worth overlooking her grandfather's origins. She had 1 year to find someone whose title mattered more than his bank account. She found Louis Mountbatten in less than 6 months. Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten was born Prince Louis of Battenberg in 1900, which meant he entered the world with a title and immediately began losing it. His family was minor German royalty connected by blood to half the crowned heads of Europe and by bank account to almost nothing useful. His father had served in the British Royal Navy for 40 years, rising to First Sea Lord before being forced to resign in 1914, when public hatred of Germans made his surname a liability. The family anglicized their name to Mountbatten, accepted a lesser British title, and watched their children grow up understanding that proximity to power was not the same as possessing it. Louis had charm, good looks, and an acute awareness that he would need to acquire money from somewhere. The Navy paid enough to survive, but not enough to maintain the standard of living his relatives enjoyed. His uncle was the Tsar of Russia until he was shot in a basement. His cousin was King George V, who provided patronage but not income. Louis understood early that he existed in a particular kind of poverty, the kind where you were invited everywhere, but could not afford to reciprocate, where you wore tailored uniforms that hid the fact that you owned 3 shirts. He met Edwina Ashley at a ball in 1920. She was 18, newly wealthy and surrounded by men whose interest was entirely financial. He was 20, recently returned from a royal tour of India, and calculating. They danced twice. He asked questions about her grandfather that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. She noticed that he did not mention money once, which meant he had thought carefully about not mentioning it. Their courtship lasted 8 months and was conducted with the efficiency of a business negotiation. Louis was stationed in Portsmouth but managed to appear in London with surprising frequency. They attended the same parties, sat near each other at dinners, and were photographed together often enough that newspapers began speculating. Edwina's father approved. Mountbatten was exactly the kind of match Ernest Cassell had envisioned, titled enough to matter, poor enough to be grateful. Louis's family approved. £2 million solved many problems, and Edwina's grandfather's origins could be overlooked when that much money was involved. Neither of them pretended it was a love match. Years later, in letters that were never meant to be published, Louis admitted he had pursued Edwina because marrying her was the smartest tactical decision he had ever made. Edwina never wrote anything so direct, but her letters from the engagement period were polite, detailed about wedding arrangements, and completely devoid of emotional content. She described the dress, the guest list, the flowers. She did not describe how she felt about the man she was about to marry. The wedding in February 1922 was excessive in the specific way that insecure wealth is excessive. 2,000 guests filled St. Margaret's Westminster. Edwina wore a dress that cost £800 and would be worn once. The reception at Brooke House, her grandfather's mansion, required hiring extra staff for the week. The wedding presents filled 3 rooms and included gifts from the King and Queen, from the Prince of Wales, from every important family in England, who wanted to be recorded as having acknowledged the marriage. The newspapers covered it as a fairy tale, the beautiful heiress and the dashing naval officer. What they did not mention was that Louis had borrowed money to buy Edwina's engagement ring, or that the honeymoon was funded entirely by her inheritance, or that the marriage settlement gave Louis access to income he would never have earned in a lifetime of naval service. The coverage treated it as romance when it was actually a merger, and both parties knew it. They honeymooned in Europe for 3 months, traveling with the kind of luxury that only Edwina's money made possible. Paris, then the south of France, then Spain. Louis kept a detailed diary of where they went and who they saw. Edwina wrote fewer letters than expected and said less in them. When they returned to England, they moved into Brooke House, the Park Lane mansion Edwina had inherited. It had 30 rooms, a ballroom, a staff of 20, and the persistent smell of her grandfather's cigars in the library. Louis returned to naval duty almost immediately. He was stationed in Portsmouth and came home on weekends when his schedule allowed. Edwina was left to manage the house, which meant managing staff who had served her grandfather and now served her with the same efficient coldness. She was 20 years old, married, wealthy, and spent most of her time alone in a house designed for entertaining hundreds. She began filling the emptiness with motion. Parties every week, sometimes twice a week. Dinners that started at 8 and ended at 2 in the morning. Weekend house parties in the country where guests arrived Friday and left Monday. She developed a reputation for being an excellent hostess, organized, attentive, ensuring everyone had enough to drink and someone interesting to talk to. What people did not notice was that she rarely sat down during these events, that she moved from group to group without joining any conversation for long, that her smile was identical at 9 in the evening and 2 in the morning. Her first pregnancy was announced in 1923. The newspapers treated it as joyful news. Edwina spent most of it sick, exhausted, and reading novels in bed. Louis was at sea for the majority of the pregnancy. He returned for the birth in February 1924, a daughter named Patricia. The baby was healthy. Edwina recovered slowly. Louis stayed for 2 weeks, then returned to his ship. Patricia was raised by a nanny, then by a series of nannies. Edwina saw her daughter in the mornings before breakfast, and sometimes in the late afternoon before dinner parties. This was not unusual for women of her class. What was unusual was how little Edwina seemed to notice the child at all. She ensured Patricia had excellent care, proper clothing, scheduled doctor visits. She performed the administrative duties of motherhood without ever appearing interested in the emotional ones. A second daughter, Pamela, was born in 1929. The same arrangements applied: nannies, nurseries, scheduled brief appearances. Edwina and Louis now had the required heir and spare, which meant they had fulfilled the expectations of marriage. What happened next was not discussed explicitly, but understood by both of them. The marriage had served its purpose, and they were now free to pursue separate lives within it. Louis took a mistress within the year, a married woman whose husband was conveniently away. Edwina learned about it through staff gossip and did not confront him. Instead, she took her own lover, a man whose name she never recorded in any letter that survived. It was not revenge. It was simply permission granted to herself to stop pretending the marriage was anything other than what it had always been, a transaction that had successfully completed, leaving two people legally bound and emotionally unconnected. They began sleeping in separate bedrooms. They continued appearing together at public events, smiling in photographs, hosting parties where they stood on opposite sides of the room. No one outside the household knew the marriage had ended in everything but name, and because no one knew, nothing had to change. The separate bedrooms were explained to staff as a practical arrangement. Louis kept irregular naval hours, and Edwina was a light sleeper. The explanation was accepted because it needed to be accepted, and because the staff at Brookhouse had long ago learned that their employment depended on noticing nothing. They cleaned both bedrooms each morning, changed both sets of sheets, and maintained the fiction that this was a marriage rather than a cohabitation agreement between two people who had gotten what they needed from each other. Edwina's lovers became more frequent after 1925. She was careful about discretion in the beginning, choosing men who were married themselves, who had as much to lose as she did, who understood that these were arrangements rather than affairs. She met them in hotel rooms booked under false names, or at country houses where the host was complicit, or occasionally at Brookhouse itself when Louis was at sea and the staff had been given the evening off. She did not keep letters. She did not keep photographs. She kept nothing that could be used against her later. Louis, for his part, conducted his own affairs with less caution. He was seen at restaurants with women who were not his wife, at theater performances in boxes purchased for two, at weekend parties where his bedroom assignments were common knowledge among guests. He did not seem to care who knew. His position in the Navy was secure enough, his royal connections protective enough, that scandal would have to be much worse than infidelity to damage him. He had married money, produced heirs, and considered his obligations fulfilled. The children grew up in the space between their parents' separate lives. Patricia and Pamela had their own floor at Brookhouse, their own staff, their own schedules that rarely intersected with Edwina or Louis except at carefully staged moments. Christmas morning photographs showed the family together, everyone dressed properly, the girls holding new toys they would hand back to the nanny as soon as the photographer left. Summer holidays were spent at country estates with other children, whose parents were also elsewhere, all of them raised by staff who were kind enough, but paid to be there. Patricia, the elder, developed her father's reserve and her mother's efficiency. She was a quiet child who learned early not to expect attention, and therefore did not ask for it. Pamela was louder, more demanding, and was corrected for it by nannies who explained that young ladies did not raise their voices or cry in front of guests. Both girls attended the same boarding schools their mother had attended, sent away at ages young enough that they would not remember home as a place where they had been wanted. Edwina wrote to them weekly when they were at school, short letters that asked about their studies and reminded them to be polite to their teachers. The letters were dutiful and distant, signed Mother rather than any term of endearment. Patricia saved them for years, kept in a box she rarely opened, evidence of something that looked like parenting from a distance, but felt like nothing at all. In 1927, Louis was promoted to Fleet Wireless Officer, a position that required him to be at sea for months at a time. Edwina used his absences to travel. Paris, Monte Carlo, New York. She went with friends, with lovers, sometimes alone. She stayed in the best hotels, bought clothing she wore once, gambled at casinos where the staff knew her by name. She spent money the way other people breathed, constantly and without thinking about it, because there was always more and because spending it was easier than sitting still long enough to consider what else she might do with her life. Her friends during this period were other wealthy women in similar marriages, women whose husbands were titled and absent, who filled their days with shopping and their nights with parties, who spoke about their children in the abstract way one might speak about a property one owned but never visited. They traveled together, threw elaborate parties for each other, and conducted affairs that everyone knew about, but no one acknowledged directly. It was a life built entirely on surfaces, where depth was considered poor taste and emotional honesty was something that happened to other classes. There were moments when the arrangement failed to hold. In 1928, Edwina became involved with a man named Ted. His full name was never recorded in any document that survived, which suggests either discretion or insignificance. He was married, titled, and by all accounts more interested in her than the others had been. They were seen together too often, at too many public places. Rumors reached Louis through his fellow officers, delivered with the casual cruelty of men who enjoyed watching another man be humiliated. Louis confronted her in the library at Brooke House on one of his brief returns to London. No record exists of what was said, but staff reported hearing raised voices, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. The next morning, Edwina left for Paris and stayed there for 6 weeks. Ted's name disappeared from her social calendar. When she returned to London, she and Louis appeared together at a dinner for the king, smiling, correct, giving no indication that anything had changed. What changed was the unspoken agreement between them. Louis would tolerate her affairs as long as they remained private enough not to damage his career. Edwina would tolerate his as long as he continued providing the title and social position that justified the marriage. They would appear together at required events, maintain the fiction for their daughters, and otherwise live as two people who happened to share legal documents and an address. The marriage had become what many marriages in their circle were, a public performance maintained for the sake of inheritance, social standing, and avoiding scandal. Neither of them was happy, but happiness had never been the objective. The objective had been advancement, and in that narrow measure the marriage had succeeded. Louis had money, status, and freedom to pursue other women. Edwina had a title, social position, and freedom to pursue other men. Their daughters had parents who were technically present and emotionally unavailable, which was common enough in their class to seem normal. In 1929, the stock market collapsed. Edwina's fortune, invested conservatively by her grandfather's former advisors, survived mostly intact. She did not reduce her spending. She did not reconsider her lifestyle. The economic catastrophe that destroyed millions of families barely touched her, except as a topic of conversation at dinner parties, where people who had lost half their wealth commiserated with each other while being served courses by staff who were grateful to still have jobs. Edwina was 28 years old. She had been married for 7 years. She had 2 daughters she barely knew, a husband she saw occasionally, and enough money to ensure that nothing about her life would ever have to change unless she chose to change it. She had not yet discovered that freedom without purpose is its own kind of prison, or that motion is not the same as progress. She was about to spend the next decade running faster. Brooke House stood on Park Lane with the kind of architectural confidence that new money builds to prove it has arrived. Ernest Cassell had commissioned it in 1905, hiring architects to design something that looked as if it had been owned by the same family for generations. The result was a mansion with 35 rooms, a ballroom that could hold 300 guests, and bathrooms more elaborate than most people's bedrooms. It was meant to announce permanence. Instead, it announced insecurity on a massive scale. Edwina inherited the house along with everything else, and with it the expectation that she would use it the way her grandfather had, as a stage for social performance. The ballroom could not sit empty. The dining room was built to seat 40 and looked wrong with fewer. The staff of 22 required constant employment to justify their wages, which meant constant entertaining to justify the staff. The house had been designed to demand use, and Edwina, with nothing else structuring her time, used it. The parties began small, dinners for 12, gatherings that ended by midnight. Then they grew. Edwina discovered she had a talent for orchestration, for knowing exactly which guests would spark interesting conversation and which would bore everyone into leaving early. She learned how to manage seating arrangements so that feuding aristocrats were placed far enough apart to remain civil, how to ensure the wine was good enough to impress but not so expensive that people felt they were being shown up, how to time the evening so that guests left feeling they had stayed exactly the right amount of time. By 1930, her parties were among the most sought-after invitations in London. Artists, politicians, minor royalty, wealthy Americans passing through, anyone who mattered either attended or wished they had been invited. The newspapers mentioned her gatherings the way they mentioned theater openings, as events worth noting. She appeared in society columns with increasing frequency, always described as glamorous, charming, the perfect hostess. What the columns did not mention was that she planned these events with the meticulous focus some people applied to military campaigns, or that she barely ate during them, or that she was usually asleep by noon the following day because she had been awake until 4, managing the last drunk guest into a taxi. The house itself became her primary occupation. She redecorated constantly, new wallpaper in the drawing room, new furniture in the library, new curtains in the bedrooms that cost more than a school teacher's annual salary. She hired decorators, then fired them when their vision did not match hers, then hired different ones. She replaced carpets that were only 2 years old because she had decided she disliked the pattern. She spent thousands of pounds on paintings she hung for a season and then moved to storage. The staff managed the physical maintenance, but Edwina managed everything else: the menus, the guest lists, the flower arrangements, the exact angle at which chairs should be positioned in the drawing room. She held meetings with the head butler every morning to discuss the day's schedule, reviewing details that most employers would have delegated entirely. She needed the house to be perfect, not because perfection mattered, but because managing perfection consumed hours that would otherwise have been empty. Lewis was rarely there. His naval career kept him at sea or stationed in Portsmouth, and when he was in London he often stayed at his club rather than coming home. He appeared for important parties, stood beside Edwina in receiving lines, and then disappeared into conversations with other men about naval strategy and politics. He did not notice the new wallpaper. He did not comment on the menu changes. He existed in the house as a guest who happened to have his name on the deed. The daughters were present but peripheral. Patricia and Pamela had their own wing, their own staff, their own schedules that intersected with their mother's only at designated times. Breakfast together on Sunday mornings when Edwina was in London and awake early enough. Brief appearances before dinner parties so guests could remark on how lovely the children were. Holidays at country estates where the girls were supervised by nannies while Edwina entertained in the main house. Patricia, now 6 years old, had learned to be quiet and unobtrusive. She played alone in the nursery, read books that were too advanced for her age, and asked questions of the staff instead of her mother. When Edwina did spend time with her, Patricia performed the role of well-behaved daughter. With the same careful attention, Edwina performed the role of hostess, saying the right things, sitting properly, betraying no actual feeling. Pamela, 2 years younger, had not yet learned to hide herself. She cried when she wanted attention, threw tantrums when she was ignored, and was corrected by nannies who explained that mother was very busy and little girls needed to be patient. She developed elaborate fantasies about her mother, that Edwina was secretly planning wonderful surprises, that the distance was temporary, that one day there would be more time. The fantasies persisted until they did not, replaced gradually by the understanding that the nannies were the real parents, and Edwina was someone who appeared occasionally in expensive clothing. The expense itself was worth noting. Edwina's wardrobe in 1930 was valued at over £20,000. Gowns from Paris, shoes from Italy, jewelry that required insurance policies. She changed clothing 3 or 4 times a day depending on her schedule, each outfit selected to communicate the exact right message for the occasion. The jewelry alone required a lady's maid whose sole responsibility was maintaining and organizing it. She owned pearls that had belonged to Indian royalty, diamonds purchased from estates of bankrupt Russian aristocrats, emeralds set in platinum that she wore once and then never thought about again. She was photographed constantly, which was partly unavoidable for someone of her social position and partly intentional. She understood that visibility was a form of currency, that being seen at the right places with the right people maintained her status as someone who mattered. She appeared in Tatler, in society pages of newspapers, in magazines that covered the lives of the wealthy as if they were foreign countries worth documenting. The photographs showed a beautiful woman in beautiful clothing at beautiful parties. They did not show what she did during the empty hours between events, or that she had begun taking pills to sleep because lying awake in a 35-room house was unbearable. The pills were prescribed by a doctor in Harley Street who asked no questions about why a healthy woman in her 20s needed chemical help sleeping. She started with 1 pill, then 2, then began taking them earlier in the evening, because waiting until bedtime meant lying awake thinking about things she preferred not to think about. The pills worked. She slept. What happened during sleep did not count, which meant the hours she was unconscious were hours she did not have to fill with purpose. By 1931, her typical week looked like this: Monday, recovery from weekend parties. Tuesday, planning the next event. Wednesday, fittings for new clothing, lunch with friends, possibly a matinee if something interesting was playing. Thursday, supervising household changes, redecorations, staff meetings, menu planning. Friday, preparing for weekend guests. Saturday and Sunday, hosting, performing, ensuring everyone was entertained and no one noticed that she had not sat down or eaten a full meal since Friday morning. It was exhausting in the specific way that meaningless work is exhausting. The fatigue came not from the difficulty, but from the emptiness underneath. The house demanded performance, and Edwina performed, but no one ever asked what she would have done if the house had not been there, or if someone had suggested that perhaps she did not need to fill every silence with motion, or if she wanted something beyond being admired by people who would forget her the moment someone more interesting appeared. The affair with Laddie Sanford began in the summer of 1931 and was conducted with so little discretion that even people who did not follow society gossip knew about it within weeks. Sanford was an American polo player, wealthy in his own right, married to a woman who spent most of her time in New York. He was handsome in an obvious way, athletic, and pursued Edwina with the confidence of someone who had never been refused anything. They met at a polo match in Windsor. Edwina had been attending these matches for years without paying attention to the sport itself, treating them as social occasions where the game was incidental to the gathering. Sanford was different from the English aristocrats she usually entertained. Louder, more direct, unbothered by the subtle hierarchies that governed every interaction in her usual circle. He asked her to dinner the same day they met. She accepted before remembering that Lewis was supposed to be in London that weekend. Lewis was not in London that weekend. He had extended his stay in Portsmouth without bothering to inform her, which meant the dinner with Sanford happened without conflict. Then another dinner. Then a weekend at a country house where the hostess had been paid to ensure their rooms were adjacent. By August, they were being photographed together at restaurants, at races, at parties where Sanford arrived as Edwina's guest rather than his own invitation. The affair was different from the previous ones because Sanford did not understand the rules. He believed that because they were having an affair, they were in a relationship, which meant he had opinions about her schedule, her other friendships, her marriage. He asked when she was going to leave Louis. She laughed, thinking he was joking. He was not joking. He wanted her to divorce, to marry him, to come to America where her title meant nothing and his money meant everything. Edwina had never considered divorce. Divorce meant scandal, social exile, loss of position. It meant admitting the marriage had failed, which would imply that she had failed, which was unacceptable. More than that, divorce meant disruption to an arrangement that was functioning adequately. Louis provided the Mountbatten name and the social access that came with it. She provided the money that allowed him to live beyond his naval salary. Neither of them loved the other, but love had never been part of the contract. Sanford did not understand this because he was American, and Americans treated marriage differently, as something connected to feeling rather than function. He pushed. He asked again about divorce. He suggested that her social position in England was provincial compared to what she could have in New York or California. He made the mistake of implying that her title was less important than his money. She ended it in September, cleanly and without explanation. Sanford left England angry and wrote letters she did not answer. The newspapers noted his departure and speculated about why the friendship had cooled so suddenly. Edwina did not comment. She simply moved forward to the next distraction, the next party, the next man who would not make demands she could not meet. But something had shifted. The affair with Sanford had required lying more extensively than usual, to staff, to friends, to Louis during the rare times he was present. The lies themselves were not difficult, but they accumulated in a way that made the entire structure of her life feel precarious. She was managing a household, 2 children, a marriage that was not a marriage, a public image that required constant maintenance, and a series of affairs that required increasing amounts of coordination to prevent collision. In October, she developed what the doctor called nervous exhaustion. She stayed in bed for a week, curtains drawn, seeing no one except the lady's maid who brought meals she did not eat. Lewis was at sea and did not know she was ill until a week after she had recovered. When he returned to London in November, he mentioned it briefly, asked if she was feeling better, accepted her assurance that it was nothing serious, and changed the subject to his promotion prospects. The children asked the nanny why Mother had been sick. The nanny explained that Mother had been very tired and needed rest. Patricia, now 7, accepted this. Pamela, 5, asked if they could visit her in bed. The nanny explained that Mother needed quiet. When Edwina recovered and resumed her schedule, neither child mentioned the illness. They had learned by then that Mother's life was separate from theirs, that her presence was occasional, and her absence was normal. In December, Louis informed her that he would be spending Christmas at sea. This was not unusual. Naval officers often worked through holidays. What was unusual was that he had volunteered for the assignment, rather than being ordered to it. Edwina understood what this meant. He preferred the ship to the house, the company of officers to the company of his wife, the routines of naval life to the performance required at Brooke House. She spent Christmas hosting a party for 40 guests. The children appeared briefly before being returned to their wing. The house was decorated with enough excess that newspapers sent photographers to document it. Edwina wore a diamond necklace that had cost more than most people earned in a decade. She smiled in every photograph. She drank enough champagne that her lady's maid had to help her undress at 3 in the morning. The next day, she woke to find a letter from her father. Wilfred Ashley wrote rarely and only about practical matters. Financial questions, property issues, occasionally news about Mary, her younger sister. This letter was different. He had heard rumors about her personal life. He did not specify which rumors, but the implication was clear. He reminded her that she had responsibilities to her children, to the family name, to the position she held in society. He suggested that perhaps she should spend less time in London and more time in the country, where life was quieter and observation was less constant. Edwina did not respond to the letter. She burned it in the library fireplace and did not mention it to anyone. But she understood what it meant. Her behavior was no longer successfully hidden, and the people who were supposed to protect family reputation were worried. She could continue as she had been and risk increasing scandal, or she could make her affairs more discreet, or she could stop entirely. She chose discretion. The next affair, which began in January 1932, was with a married diplomat whose career depended on secrecy. They met in hotel rooms booked by a third party, communicated through coded telegrams, and were never photographed together. It was joyless and efficient, which suited both of them. Edwina had learned that the only way to maintain the life she had built was to hide more carefully what she was actually doing. The marriage continued, the parties continued, the children grew older in their separate wing. Louis came home occasionally and left again quickly. Brooke House remained immaculate, expensive, and empty of anything that resembled family. And Edwina, at 30 years old, had perfected the art of appearing to have everything while possessing almost nothing that mattered. In 1947, Louis Mountbatten received the appointment that would define his career and alter both their lives in ways neither had anticipated. He was named the last Viceroy of India, tasked with overseeing the transfer of power from British rule to Indian independence. It was a position of immense political importance and spectacular timing, arriving just as an empire was collapsing, charged with managing the end of something that had taken centuries to build. For Louis, it was the culmination of decades of careful advancement, the validation he had pursued since childhood, when his father's German name had cost them everything. For Edwina, it was something else entirely. Escape from a life that had become unbearable through repetition, from a house that felt like a mausoleum, from a social circle that knew too much about her affairs and too little about what she actually thought. They sailed for India in March with a staff of hundreds and luggage that required 3 railway cars to transport from the port in Bombay to Delhi. Edwina brought 73 pieces of luggage, not including trunks of formal gowns for state dinners and jewels that required armed guards. She was 45 years old and had spent the previous decade in a kind of accelerating desperation. More parties, more lovers, more travel that never arrived anywhere that felt different from where she started. India was different. The heat was different. The light was different. The scale of human suffering was different in ways that made London's carefully hidden poverty look almost polite. Edwina saw it immediately, on the drive from the port. Bodies sleeping on streets, children with swollen bellies, women carrying water in containers that looked older than they were. She had seen poverty before, had driven past it in England. But this was something else. This was poverty that could not be hidden or ignored or managed out of sight by efficient municipal planning. The Viceroy's house in New Delhi was larger than Brooke House and infinitely more formal. 340 rooms, 427 acres of gardens, a staff of over 500. It was designed to project imperial permanence, which made it absurd as the headquarters for dismantling that same empire. Edwina's role as vicereine was largely ceremonial, attending state functions, hosting dinners for officials and princely rulers. Being gracious and beautiful and British at events meant to demonstrate that the empire was ending with dignity rather than collapse. She performed the role for approximately 3 weeks before it became insufficient. The state dinners felt like the parties at Brooke House, expensive, formal, and devoid of meaning. The ceremonial duties required her to smile at people she did not know while discussing matters she did not care about. She had come to India expecting distraction and found instead an amplified version of the life she had been trying to escape. Then she met Jawaharlal Nehru. He was 57, a widower, one of the principal leaders of the Indian independence movement, and soon to be the first Prime Minister of independent India. He had spent 9 years in British prisons for opposing the empire that Louis now represented. He was educated, sophisticated, and held the British aristocracy in contempt while being unable to entirely dismiss the culture they represented. He should have despised Edwina. Instead, he found her interesting. Their first meeting was at a state dinner in April, one of dozens of formal events meant to facilitate negotiation between the British government and Indian leaders over the terms of independence. Edwina was seated near Nehru, part of the careful diplomatic choreography Louis had arranged. They discussed poetry. Nehru mentioned Tagore, Edwina mentioned Yeats, and the conversation extended beyond the usual pleasantries that characterize these dinners. They met again 3 days later, this time at a smaller gathering. Then again. The meetings increased in frequency and decreased in formality. By May, they were meeting without the presence of staff, without the pretense of official business, in private rooms where the conversation was not about independence negotiations, but about everything else: literature, philosophy, history, family, loneliness. Nehru was lonely in the particular way that political leaders are lonely, surrounded constantly by people, required to project strength and certainty, unable to admit doubt or vulnerability to anyone whose support he needed. Edwina was lonely in the way that wealthy women are lonely, surrounded by luxury, admired by everyone, and unknown by anyone, including herself. They recognized something in each other that neither had expected to find. The affair began in June, though calling it an affair does not capture what it actually was. They were not having sex in the urgent physical way that characterized Edwina's previous affairs. Nehru was older, in poor health, and exhausted by decades of political struggle. What they had instead was intimacy, long conversations that lasted hours, letters written daily when they were apart, a recognition that something essential in each of them was visible to the other in a way it had never been visible before. Louis knew. Everyone knew. The staff whispered about it. British officials noted it in reports to London. Indian politicians used it as evidence of British hypocrisy. What made it survivable was that Nehru was about to become prime minister, which meant that any scandal involving him could complicate the independence negotiations that Louis had been sent to complete. Discretion was not about protecting Edwina's reputation, it was about protecting the political process. Edwina began accompanying Nehru to refugee camps, to hospitals, to sites of communal violence between Hindus and Muslims as the partition of India approached. She saw things that had been carefully hidden from her entire life: bodies in mass graves, children separated from families, women who had been raped and mutilated in sectarian violence. She did not faint or look away. She asked questions, took notes, and began organizing relief efforts with the same meticulous attention she had previously applied to party planning. She established medical clinics, coordinated food distribution, arranged transport for refugees who were stranded between the new borders of India and Pakistan. She worked 16-hour days in conditions that were physically demanding and emotionally overwhelming. Staff members who had known her in London barely recognized her. The woman who had changed clothing 4 times a day now wore the same practical dress for a week. The woman who had spent thousands on jewelry now spent thousands on medical supplies. The woman who had never expressed interest in anyone outside her social circle now knew the names of nurses, drivers, and relief workers. The work was not charity in the sense that wealthy women perform charity, hosting fundraising galas and writing checks from a comfortable distance. Edwina was present in the camps, handling supplies, speaking to refugees, witnessing suffering that could not be fixed with money or organization. She discovered she was good at crisis management, at making rapid decisions under pressure, at coordinating complicated logistics with limited resources. But underneath the work was Nehru. They met when they could, communicated constantly through letters that were theoretically about relief coordination, but actually about everything else. Nehru wrote to her about exhaustion, about the weight of creating a new nation from the wreckage of partition, about doubts he could not express to anyone else. Edwina wrote to him about discovering purpose for the first time in her life, about the horror of realizing how much of her previous existence had been meaningless, about fear that when she returned to England, none of what she was experiencing would survive. The partition of India in August 1947 killed approximately 1 million people in communal violence that swept across the new borders between India and Pakistan. Trains arrived at stations filled with corpses, villages burned, women were abducted, raped, and murdered as markers of sectarian revenge. Edwina worked through it all, organizing relief convoys, establishing camps, witnessing atrocities that would have sent most people of her background immediately back to the safety of the Viceroy's house. She did not return to safety. She slept in refugee camps, ate the same food as the displaced families, and pushed herself to the edge of physical collapse. Staff worried she would contract cholera or typhus. Louis, occupied with the political crisis of partition, barely saw her. Nehru saw her constantly, at relief sites, in emergency planning meetings, in brief stolen hours late at night when they could sit together without the presence of officials or staff. Their letters from this period reveal the transformation of an affair into something structural. Nehru wrote to her daily, sometimes twice daily, about decisions he was making as prime minister, about the weight of knowing that every choice resulted in someone's death, about loneliness that felt unbearable despite being surrounded by millions who needed him to be strong. Edwina's replies were equally vulnerable. She wrote about discovering that she had wasted 2 decades of her life on meaningless performance, about not knowing who she was outside of the role she had played for so long, about fear that she had failed her daughters in ways that could never be corrected. They needed each other in ways that went beyond physical attraction or emotional comfort. Nehru needed someone who had no political agenda, who would not use his vulnerability against him, who came from a world so distant from his that she could not threaten his position. Edwina needed someone who saw her as more than decorative, who valued her competence rather than her beauty, who gave her work that mattered more than seating arrangements and menu selection. The affair became public knowledge without ever being publicly acknowledged. Newspapers in India and England noted how much time the viceroy spent with the prime minister. British officials wrote memos expressing concern about the optics. Louis was questioned by colleagues about whether he could control his wife. He could not, and increasingly did not try. The independence process had succeeded. India was now independent, Pakistan existed, and Louis had completed the assignment that would define his legacy. What Edwina did with Nehru was her concern as long as it did not interfere with his own reputation. They left India in June 1948, returning to England after 15 months that had changed both of them. Louis returned as a celebrated figure, the man who had overseen the end of the British Raj, a historical figure whose name would appear in textbooks. Edwina returned as someone whose work had been noted but never quite credited, whose relationship with Nehru was gossiped about but never formally documented, whose transformation from society hostess to relief organizer was too complicated to fit into the simple narratives newspapers preferred. The return to England was devastating in ways she had not anticipated. Brooke House felt smaller than she remembered, more suffocating. Despite being physically unchanged, the parties that had once consumed her energy now felt intolerable, people discussing trivialities while she thought about refugee children she had held in camps, about mass graves she had seen, about problems that required solutions more complicated than better flower arrangements. She tried to resume her previous life and could not. She attended dinners and left early. She planned parties and canceled them. She looked at her wardrobe of expensive gowns and felt physically sick at the waist. Her friends noticed the change but did not understand it. They thought she was depressed, exhausted, traumatized by India. They were not entirely wrong, but they missed the central problem. Edwina had discovered purpose and then lost it, and nothing available in London came close to replacing what she had found. Patricia was now 24, recently married to Lord Brabourne. Pamela was 19, living at home, and had no relationship with her mother beyond polite formality. Both daughters had been raised by staff while Edwina was in India. Both had learned years earlier not to expect maternal attention. The pattern continued. Edwina saw them at designated times, asked appropriate questions about their lives, and revealed nothing about her own emotional state. She and Louis now lived almost entirely separate lives. He had been created Earl Mountbatten of Burma, given honors and appointments that kept him occupied with naval and governmental duties. They appeared together at official events, maintained separate residences, and conducted their relationship through secretaries who coordinated schedules. It was efficient and bloodless, and had been that way for so long that neither of them remembered it ever being different. Edwina corresponded with Nehru constantly. Letters arrived from India several times a week, long, detailed descriptions of political challenges, personal loneliness, the impossibility of creating a functional democracy from the chaos of partition. She wrote back with equal frequency, describing her inability to adjust to English life, her sense that she had been more real in India than she had ever been in London, her conviction that everything she was doing now was meaningless compared to what she had done there. In 1949, she returned to India. Officially, she was there to visit friends and assess ongoing relief needs. Actually, she was there to see Nehru. She stayed for 6 weeks, during which she and Nehru spent as much time together as his schedule allowed. They were not hiding the relationship. Photographs show them together at public events, at the Prime Minister's residence, in gardens where staff were present, but discreet. The Indian press treated it as a friendship between important public figures. The British press treated it as a scandal, barely contained by diplomatic necessity. Louis did not object. He had his own concerns. His naval career, his position in government, relationships with women that he conducted with the same discretion Edwina had abandoned. As long as Edwina's affair with Nehru did not damage his reputation or complicate his work, it was irrelevant to him. The marriage had been a transaction from the beginning, and both parties had extracted what they needed from it. What happened now was simply the long aftermath of a deal that had been successfully completed decades earlier. Edwina began traveling constantly after 1949. India, Southeast Asia, South America, anywhere that relief work was needed, and where her name and connections could open doors. She became involved with the St. John Ambulance Brigade, eventually becoming superintendent-in-chief. The work was similar to what she had done in India, coordinating medical relief, establishing training programs, visiting sites of disaster or conflict where her presence was supposed to boost morale. She was good at it. She had administrative skill, political connections, and the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing that this work was the only thing preventing her life from being entirely meaningless. She pushed herself relentlessly, working through illness, ignoring exhaustion, accepting assignments that required months away from England. The children barely noticed her absence. They had been raised by her absence and had built lives that did not require her presence. Patricia had her own family. Pamela had her own social circle. Both were polite when Edwina was in London, cordial, appropriate. Neither expected intimacy and neither offered it. The relationship between mother and daughters had calcified into formal courtesy years earlier, and no one involved seemed interested in breaking the pattern. In 1952, Edwina traveled to Malaya during the emergency, the British colonial government's war against communist insurgents. She was there officially to inspect St. John ambulance facilities and visit wounded soldiers. What she actually did was tour rubber plantations, where workers lived in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, visited villages that had been relocated by force as part of counterinsurgency strategy, and met with colonial administrators who spoke about the local population as if they were livestock requiring management. She took photographs, she wrote reports, she documented housing conditions, medical facilities, wage structures, and patterns of malnutrition among plantation workers. The reports were detailed, accurate, and submitted to organizations that filed them carefully and changed nothing. The rubber flowed to British manufacturers. The profits flowed to British shareholders, and the workers continued living in barracks that would have been condemned as inhumane if they had housed animals in England. Edwina noted all of this in her reports, but never connected it to the fortune she had inherited. Ernest Cassell had made his money through banking and investment, which meant he had made it through loans to companies that extracted resources, through shares in enterprises that depended on cheap labor, through financial instruments that turned human exploitation into compound interest. The rubber plantations she documented in Malaya, the textile mills in India, the mining operations across the empire, all of it was built on the same system that had produced the 2 million pounds she had inherited at 19. She never made that connection explicitly. Her reports focused on improving conditions within the existing structure: better housing for workers, more medical facilities, higher wages. She never suggested that perhaps the entire system was designed to extract maximum profit through minimum compensation, or that her own wealth was evidence of how efficiently that system functioned. She saw suffering and wanted to alleviate it. She did not see that her grandfather's fortune was suffering converted into capital. The pattern repeated across the next decade. She traveled to Cyprus during the conflict with Britain, to Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, to Aden, to Borneo, to every corner of the empire that was collapsing or in crisis. She arrived, inspected conditions, wrote reports, recommended improvements, and moved on. Local officials tolerated her visits because refusing a countess with royal connections would have been politically awkward. They listened to her recommendations, agreed that conditions should improve, and implemented nothing that would reduce profitability. She was documenting the end of empire without understanding that she was part of what was ending. The relief work she performed was genuine. She arranged medical supplies, established clinics, trained local staff in basic health care. But it was also a kind of theater, a performance that allowed the British establishment to claim they cared about colonial welfare while maintaining the economic structures that made that welfare impossible. In 1955, she toured British Guiana, where sugar plantation workers were striking for wages that would allow them to feed their families. She visited the plantations, met with workers, documented their living conditions in barracks that had not been improved since slavery was formally abolished. She wrote a report recommending wage increases and better housing. The plantation owners, many of whom were companies in which her own investments held shares, ignored the recommendations. The strike was broken by colonial police. Production resumed at previous wage levels. Edwina moved on to the next crisis, the next tour, the next opportunity to document suffering without examining why the suffering persisted. She was sincerely moved by what she witnessed. Her letters to Nehru during this period are filled with horror at conditions she encountered, frustration at the resistance to reform, exhaustion from traveling constantly between sites of crisis. What the letters never contained was any recognition that the system she was trying to improve from within was functioning exactly as designed. Her wealth made the relief work possible and simultaneously undermined it. She could travel anywhere because she could afford it. She could command attention because of her title and connections. She could establish programs because she had money to donate and contacts to pressure for funding. But the money came from investments in the same colonial enterprises she was documenting. The title came from a marriage purchased with a fortune built on exploitation, and the connections existed because she was part of the establishment that benefited from keeping everything fundamentally unchanged. Nehru understood this in ways that Edwina either could not or would not. His letters to her during this period grew more pointed. He praised her work, but questioned its premises. He asked why she focused on improving working conditions on plantations, rather than questioning why plantations existed in their current form. He suggested that relief work that left power structures intact was ultimately a tool for maintaining those structures by making them slightly more tolerable. Edwina responded defensively. She argued that immediate suffering required immediate relief, that systemic change was beyond her capacity, that incremental improvement was better than abandoning people to their current conditions. She was not wrong, but she was also avoiding the larger question: whether her relief work was actually helping or simply making colonial exploitation sustainable. By reducing its most visible brutality, the tours continued. By 1958, she had traveled to over 60 countries, most of them places where Britain was either maintaining colonial control or managing its withdrawal. She had written hundreds of reports, established dozens of programs, and spent considerable portions of her fortune on relief efforts. The work consumed her completely. She was away from England more than she was present, traveling constantly between crisis zones, sleeping in military barracks or local hospitals because hotels were unavailable or inappropriate. Her health declined visibly. She had always been thin, but now looked skeletal. She developed chronic digestive problems that doctors attributed to stress and contaminated food in places without proper sanitation. She caught malaria twice, dengue fever once, and continued traveling through both. Staff members who accompanied her on tours reported that she slept 4 or 5 hours a night, ate irregularly, and refused to slow down even when obviously ill. The work had become the only thing preventing complete collapse of meaning. If she stopped traveling, stopped organizing relief efforts, stopped documenting suffering, she would have to return to England and confront what her life actually was: a failed marriage to a man she barely knew, 2 daughters who were strangers, a social circle that bored her, and wealth that had purchased nothing except the capacity to witness suffering she was powerless to prevent. Patricia and Pamela saw their mother occasionally during these years, usually when Edwina passed through London between assignments. The visits were brief and awkward. Edwina asked appropriate questions about their lives, shared carefully edited stories from her travels, and departed within a day or two for the next flight. Patricia, now with children of her own, had given up expecting anything else. Pamela, still unmarried and living a life of wealthy aimlessness, had not given up but was approaching the point where she would. Louis was pursuing his own final act, still in the Navy, still collecting honors and appointments, still conducting affairs with the discretion of someone who had spent a lifetime managing appearances. He and Edwina communicated through secretaries, saw each other at Christmas if schedules aligned, and maintained the public fiction of a marriage that had effectively ended 30 years earlier. 30 years. Patricia Mountbatten married John Knatchbull, 7th Baron Brabourne, in 1946, 3 months before her parents left for India. She was 22 years old and had known her fiancé for less than a year. The engagement was appropriate. He was titled wealthy enough from a family whose lineage was unquestionable. Edwina attended the wedding, wore the correct clothing, smiled in photographs, and left for India shortly afterward, without appearing to notice that her elder daughter had just made the same kind of strategic marriage she herself had made 24 years earlier. Patricia did not expect more. She had been raised by nannies, educated at boarding schools, and trained to understand that maternal attention was not something she should require. When she was 6 years old, she had stopped asking when mother would have time to see her. By 12, she had stopped thinking about it. By 22, she had organized her entire emotional life around the absence of emotional attention, which meant she barely noticed when Edwina left for India without asking if Patricia might want her mother present during the early months of marriage. The letters between them during Patricia's first pregnancy in 1947 were formal to the point of parody. Edwina wrote from India asking appropriate questions about Patricia's health and offering practical advice about managing staff during confinement. Patricia responded with brief updates that revealed nothing about fear, discomfort, or the experience of becoming a mother without having had a mother who was present. When Patricia gave birth to a son in 1948, Edwina was still in India. She sent a telegram congratulating Patricia and a gift that had been selected and shipped by staff. Patricia named her son Norton. She raised him the same way she had been raised, with nannies, careful schedules, appropriate distance between mother and child. She did not repeat her mother's pattern consciously. She simply did not know how to do anything else. Love was not something that had been modeled for her, so she provided what had been provided to her: safety, education, material comfort, and the kind of benign neglect that wealthy families called proper child rearing. Pamela's trajectory was different and worse. She was 2 years younger than Patricia, which meant she had been even younger when their mother's attention disappeared entirely. While Patricia developed resilience through emotional self-sufficiency, Pamela developed hunger. She wanted her mother's attention desperately, asked for it repeatedly, and was told by staff that mother was very busy doing important work, and little girls needed to be patient. By adolescence, Pamela had learned that the wanting itself was the problem. She stopped asking. She developed instead a kind of frantic sociability, filling her time with friends, parties, travel, anything that created the illusion of connection, without requiring actual intimacy. She was popular in her social circle, always available, always entertaining, and privately convinced that she was fundamentally unlovable because her own mother had found her insufficiently interesting to know. When Edwina returned from India in 1948, Pamela was 19 and had constructed an entire personality around compensating for maternal absence. She was bright, charming, capable of conversation with anyone, and had no idea who she actually was underneath the performance. Edwina noticed none of this. She saw a daughter who seemed to be managing well, who had friends and activities, who did not appear to need anything. It did not occur to her that Pamela's apparent self-sufficiency was evidence of profound neglect rather than successful parenting. The relationship between mother and daughters calcified into routine. Edwina saw them at Christmas, occasionally at other times when travel schedules aligned. The conversations were polite, superficial, structured around safe topics that required no emotional vulnerability. Patricia discussed her children, Pamela discussed her social calendar. Edwina discussed her relief work in terms that made it sound like charity rather than escape. No one asked real questions. No one offered real answers. In 1954, Pamela became engaged to David Nightingale Hicks, an interior designer with ambition and limited aristocratic credentials. Edwina approved the match without enthusiasm. Hicks was not titled, but he was acceptable, and Pamela was 25, which was approaching the age where remaining unmarried became socially awkward. The wedding was appropriately formal, attended by appropriate people, and Edwina was present in body while being absent in every other sense that mattered. What neither daughter knew was that Edwina thought about them more than she admitted, felt guilt that she refused to examine, and had convinced herself that providing material security was sufficient substitute for emotional presence. She had established trust funds that would ensure both daughters lived comfortably regardless of their husband's finances. She had maintained the social connections that smoothed their entry into appropriate society. She had done everything her own parents had done for her, which meant she had perpetuated exactly the pattern that had made her own childhood feel like being raised by efficient strangers. Patricia's children, she had 7 eventually, grew up with the same careful distance from their grandmother that Patricia had experienced from her mother. Edwina visited when she was in England, brought expensive gifts purchased by staff, and spent brief supervised time with grandchildren, who were instructed to be polite and well-behaved. The children called her grandmama and understood that she was important and busy and not someone who would read them stories or sit on the floor playing with them. Pamela's marriage deteriorated quickly. Hicks was controlling, concerned primarily with his own career, and had married Pamela for her connections and money rather than affection. By 1960, Pamela was trapped in the same kind of loveless contractual marriage her mother had escaped only through money and title. But Pamela lacked her mother's fortune. She had a trust fund, but not independence. She had learned to perform happiness, but not how to recognize or pursue actual contentment. Edwina noticed none of this, or noticed and did not know how to address it, or noticed and decided that Pamela needed to manage her own marriage the way Edwina had managed hers. The pattern repeated, absence justified as respect for autonomy, neglect framed as allowing adult children to live their own lives, emotional distance maintained through careful adherence to appropriate boundaries. In letters to Nehru during this period, Edwina occasionally mentioned her daughters, brief references to Patricia's children, to Pamela's marriage, to feeling that she had failed them in ways she could not quite articulate. Nehru, who had his own complicated relationship with his daughter Indira, responded with sympathy, but no solutions. They were both people who had sacrificed family intimacy for public purpose, who had convinced themselves that the sacrifice was necessary, and who were beginning to suspect they might have been wrong. Patricia kept letters from her mother, dozens of them, accumulated over decades, each one polite and distant and revealing nothing. She stored them in a box and rarely looked at them. They were evidence of a relationship that had existed in form but never in substance, proof that her mother had performed the administrative duties of parenthood while never engaging with the emotional ones. Pamela kept fewer letters because Edwina wrote to her less frequently. Patricia was the heir, the one who had produced the grandchildren, the one whose marriage was stable. Pamela was the younger daughter whose life had not unfolded as successfully. which meant she received less attention, which reinforced her conviction that she was loved less, which was probably accurate in the transactional way that Edwina understood love. By 1960, Patricia was 36, with 7 children and a marriage that functioned adequately. Pamela was 31 with no children and a marriage that was failing. Edwina was 58, traveling constantly, writing detailed reports about suffering in distant countries, and had not had a substantive conversation with either daughter in years. The family existed in name, in legal documents, in trust fund disbursements and Christmas cards, but not in any form that involved knowing each other beyond the roles they had been assigned. Edwina's fortune in 1960 was still vast, despite decades of spending that would have bankrupted most families. The original £2 million her grandfather had left her in 1921 had been invested conservatively enough that even her extravagant lifestyle had not depleted it. She owned properties in London and the country, held shares in companies across the empire, and received income from trusts that her grandfather had structured to survive even determined wastefulness. She spent it constantly, but not enjoyably. The early years had featured genuine excess: the parties, the clothing, the jewelry that filled rooms. By 1960, the spending had become mechanical. She donated large sums to St. John Ambulance, funded medical programs in former colonies, established scholarships for nursing students. The money moved from her accounts to various causes with the efficiency of water finding downward paths, and she felt nothing about any of it except a vague sense that spending money on relief work was morally superior to spending it on personal luxury. What she never examined was whether the relief work was actually relief or simply maintenance. The medical programs she funded in Malaya served workers on plantations that produced profits for companies in which she held shares. The scholarships she established trained nurses who would work in understaffed colonial hospitals that existed because the British administration refused to fund adequate health care. She was paying to alleviate problems that her own investment portfolio helped create, and the circularity of this never appeared in any letter she wrote or any thought she recorded. Her investments were managed by the same firm that had managed her grandfather's fortune, conservative, focused on stable returns, unconcerned with the human cost of those returns. She received quarterly reports showing dividends from rubber, from textiles, from mining operations, from banks that financed all of the above. She signed the documents acknowledging receipt and never asked what conditions produced those profits, or whether the workers in those enterprises earned enough to feed their children. In 1961, she visited a textile mill in Lancashire that was closing due to competition from cheaper production in India and Pakistan. She met with workers who were losing jobs their families had held for 3 generations, who had no education beyond basic literacy, who were facing unemployment in towns where the mill was the only significant employer. She wrote a letter to local officials suggesting retraining programs and government assistance. She did not mention that her own fortune included shares in the Indian mills that were undercutting Lancashire wages, or that the competition she sympathized with was partially enabled by her investment decisions. The disconnection was not unique to her. It was how wealth functioned in her class and her era. Money was managed by professionals who ensured it grew. The mechanisms of that growth were considered technical matters, inappropriate for discussion in social settings, irrelevant to questions of character or morality. Edwina was generous with her money, which meant she was a good person. Where the money came from was simply not part of the moral calculation. She increased her charitable giving throughout the 1960s as her health declined and travel became more difficult. The St. John Ambulance Brigade received substantial donations. Medical facilities in former colonies received funding for equipment and training. Nursing organizations received endowments. The money flowed out at a rate that finally began to reduce the principal, and she felt virtuous about the reduction without examining whether virtue was possible. When the wealth being given away had been extracted through exploitation that continued even as she wrote the checks. Louis had his own fortune by this point, accumulated through naval salary, investments, and gifts from wealthy admirers who valued proximity to royalty. His spending was more restrained than Edwina's, but followed similar patterns, maintaining properties, funding causes that enhanced his reputation, ensuring that his position in society remained secure. They had separate finances, separate accountants, separate charitable priorities. The marriage had been a merger that had fully divested decades earlier. The properties became burdensome. Brooke House was sold in 1965, the mansion that had defined Edwina's life for 40 years, that had required staff of 20 to maintain, that had been the stage for countless performances of wealth and status. She sold it to developers who demolished it and built a modern hotel on the site. The sale was practical. She could no longer afford the maintenance, the staff had decreased to a level where the house could not be properly run, and she was rarely in London anyway. What the sale revealed was how little the house had actually mattered. She had spent decades filling it with parties, with guests, with constant motion, meant to disguise emptiness. When it was gone, she felt relief rather than loss. The house had been an obligation she had finally shed, and the fact that it had once been the center of her existence made the relief more profound rather than less. The country estate went next, Broadlands, a property in Hampshire that Louis had inherited from his family, remained in their possession, but Edwina stopped visiting. It was too large, too formal, too filled with memories of weekends spent entertaining people she had not actually liked. Louis kept it for shooting parties and political gatherings. Edwina left it to him and stopped thinking about it. She was liquidating her life in pieces, converting property and possessions into cash that could be donated or spent on travel. The process felt like progress, reducing attachment to material things, simplifying, focusing on what mattered. What she did not recognize was that she had never been attached to the things themselves. She had been attached to what they represented, and when they stopped representing anything that felt meaningful, they became weight she was grateful to discard. Her will, updated repeatedly throughout the 1960s, distributed the remaining fortune among family, staff, and charitable organizations. Patricia received the largest bequest, not because Edwina loved her more than Pamela, but because Patricia had more children who would need provision. Pamela received less, along with a trust fund that would prevent her husband from accessing the principal. Staff members who had been with the family for decades received pensions. St. John Ambulance received a substantial endowment. The will was practical, detailed, and emotionally empty. It distributed assets according to need and obligation without conveying anything about relationship or feeling. Reading it was like reading a corporate dissolution document. Everything accounted for. Nothing personal, no evidence that the person writing it had loved anyone or been loved by anyone in return. By 1968, Edwina's net worth had decreased significantly from its peak, but remained substantial. Enough to live comfortably for several more decades if she reduced her spending. Enough to fund continued relief work if she maintained her health. She did neither. She increased her spending on medical programs while her own health deteriorated, and she traveled constantly despite doctors warning that she needed rest. The fortune that had defined her entire life had become something she was actively trying to exhaust, as if spending all of it would somehow retroactively justify having had it in the first place. She gave away money with increasing urgency, funding programs that would continue after her death, establishing endowments meant to outlast her. But the urgency felt less like generosity and more like panic, a race to convert wealth into purpose before discovering that the conversion was impossible. Jawaharlal Nehru's health began failing in 1962, visibly and undeniably. He was 72 years old and had been Prime Minister of India for 15 years, carrying the weight of governing a nation of 400 million people through partition, famine, war with Pakistan, and the impossible task of creating functional democracy from colonial wreckage. The work had consumed him completely, and what remained was a man who looked 20 years older than his actual age, who tired easily, who had stopped sleeping more than a few hours each night. Edwina saw it during her visit to Delhi in January 1963. Nehru met her at the Prime Minister's residence, and the change from her previous visit 2 years earlier was severe enough that she mentioned it in a letter to Patricia, carefully, without admitting how frightened she was. He moved slowly, forgot details mid-conversation, and sat down frequently during discussions that would previously have animated him for hours. His doctors had recommended rest. He had ignored them because rest meant reducing his workload, and reducing his workload meant admitting he could no longer carry what he had carried for decades. They spent 3 weeks together during that visit, more time than Nehru could afford, but which he made available anyway. They walked in the gardens at the residence, more slowly than before. They discussed politics, books, family, loneliness. Edwina told him about selling Brooke House, about feeling that she had wasted decades of her life on meaningless performance. Nehru told her about the Chinese border war the previous year, about feeling that everything he had built was fragile enough to collapse, about exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. What they did not discuss was that he was dying, and both of them knew it. The pretense that this was temporary, that rest would restore him, that they would have years more of letters and visits, they maintained that pretense because acknowledging the alternative was unbearable. Edwina had spent her entire life avoiding unbearable truths through motion and distraction. Nehru had spent his life avoiding them through work and political purpose. Neither of them knew how to stop performing strength long enough to admit fear. She left India in February with a sense that she would not see him again. The feeling was not dramatic or certain, just a quiet knowledge that his decline was accelerating, and her own health was too poor to make regular travel to India sustainable. They wrote to each other with the same frequency as before, but the letters changed. Nehru wrote less about politics and more about fatigue, about difficulty concentrating, about minor strokes his doctors suspected, but could not prove. Edwina wrote about her own declining health, about increasing difficulty traveling, about relief work that felt less urgent now that the person she most wanted to discuss it with was fading. In January 1964, Nehru had a stroke severe enough that it could not be hidden from the public. The news reached Edwina through official channels before his personal letter arrived. She read about it in newspapers that speculated about whether India's founding prime minister would survive, about succession plans, about the end of an era. His letter arrived 3 days later, written in handwriting that was barely legible, assuring her that he would recover and they would see each other soon. She did not believe the assurance, and the subsequent letters made clear that he did not believe it either. He wrote about arranging his papers, about conversations with his daughter Indira, about governance after his death, about feeling that he had left too many things undone. Edwina responded with letters that tried to be encouraging, but mostly revealed her own panic at the prospect of losing the only person who had ever known her as something other than decorative or useful. Nehru died on May 27, 1964, of a heart attack following a series of strokes. Edwina received the news by telegram while she was in London, sitting in the drawing room of the house she had moved to after selling Brook House. She read the telegram twice, placed it on the table beside her, and sat without moving for long enough that the staff became concerned and knocked on the door to ask if she needed anything. She did not attend the funeral. India's state funeral for Nehru was a massive public event with hundreds of thousands of mourners, and Edwina's presence would have created complications. Questions about their relationship, about propriety, about whether the widow of the last viceroy should be prominently mourning the first prime minister. She stayed in London and received condolence letters from officials who had known both of them, from friends who understood what Nehru had meant to her, from strangers who had read about their friendship in newspapers and assumed it was simply diplomatic courtesy. Louis sent a formal condolence message through official channels. He did not mention Nehru to Edwina directly, and she did not mention him to Louis. The relationship between Edwina and Nehru had existed in parallel to her marriage for 17 years, known by everyone and acknowledged by no one in the family. Nehru's death did not change that pattern. It simply meant the parallel had ended. Edwina's letters to Patricia and Pamela in the months following Nehru's death were brief and revealed nothing about grief. She mentioned his death as a significant loss for India, as the end of an important political era, as sad news. She did not mention that she was barely sleeping, that she had stopped eating regularly, that she sat for hours reading old letters Nehru had written, and then carefully filing them away in boxes she would not allow staff to touch. The grief was private and enormous, and had nowhere to go. She could not mourn publicly, because doing so would require explaining what Nehru had been to her, and she had spent her entire life avoiding that kind of emotional transparency. She could not mourn within her family, because her family consisted of a husband she barely knew, and daughters who had learned not to expect emotional honesty from her. She could not mourn with friends, because her friendships were social rather than intimate, built on shared activities rather than shared vulnerability. Instead, she worked. She increased her travel schedule, accepting assignments that required flying to crisis zones with inadequate medical facilities, staying in conditions that were physically demanding for someone in her 60s with declining health. The work kept her moving, kept her distracted, kept her from sitting still long enough to fully absorb that the person who had given her life meaning for 17 years was gone and would not be replaced. In August 1964, she traveled to Borneo during the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation. She was 62 years old, recovering from a recent illness, and her doctors had explicitly advised against the trip. She went anyway, touring field hospitals, meeting with wounded soldiers, sleeping in military barracks that were hot, unsanitary, and infested with mosquitoes that carried diseases she was too tired to worry about preventing. She collapsed in September, too sick to hide it, and was evacuated to a hospital in Singapore. The diagnosis was exhaustion, malnutrition, and several infections that required intravenous antibiotics. She spent 3 weeks recovering, largely because the doctors refused to release her earlier and then resumed traveling against medical advice. Louis was informed of her hospitalization through official channels. He sent appropriate messages wishing her quick recovery, but did not visit. They had lived separate lives for so long that illness was simply another form of absence, requiring correct gestures, but not actual presence. Patricia visited briefly, stayed 2 days, and returned to England visibly worried, but uncertain what to do about a mother who had never allowed anyone to help her. Edwina returned to England in November thinner than she had been, weaker, and determined to leave again as soon as possible. Staying in London meant confronting the absence of Nehru's letters, the silence where his correspondence had been, the recognition that the structure that had supported her emotional life for nearly 2 decades had completely collapsed. She could not bear it, so she fled into work with increased desperation. The fainting spells began in 1965, sudden enough that Edwina would find herself on the floor without remembering falling. The first time, she was alone in her study and woke to find the carpet against her face, several minutes missing from memory. She told no one. The second time, staff found her collapsed in the hallway and insisted on calling a doctor despite her protests that it was nothing, just fatigue from recent travel. The doctor diagnosed low blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and severe anemia. He recommended hospitalization for testing. Edwina agreed to testing but refused hospitalization. She had appointments scheduled, relief work that needed coordination, travel planned to Malaya the following month. The doctor explained that she was exhausted to the point of physical breakdown, that her body was showing signs of prolonged malnutrition despite adequate access to food, that continuing at her current pace would likely result in something more serious than fainting. She thanked him for his concern and left for Malaya on schedule. The pattern was established. Her body would signal collapse, doctors would warn her, and she would ignore them because stopping meant confronting what her life actually was without constant motion to disguise it. Work had become the only thing preventing complete psychological collapse, which meant she could not stop working, even when it was destroying her physically. The weight loss was severe enough that clothing no longer fit properly. Her dresses hung loose, required constant alteration, and eventually had to be replaced with smaller sizes. Staff noticed that she picked at meals rather than eating them, that she survived primarily on tea and cigarettes, that she would go days eating almost nothing when she was traveling in regions where food was unfamiliar or scarce. She had always been thin, but this was different. Skeletal, the kind of thinness that indicates the body consuming itself when fuel is unavailable. Louis saw her occasionally during this period, at family gatherings that could not be avoided or official events that required joint appearance. He noticed the physical decline, but said nothing. Their relationship had never included personal questions, and age made it even less likely that he would begin asking now. If Edwina was destroying herself through overwork, that was her choice. He had his own concerns, his own health issues, his own method of managing the slow approach of death. Patricia was more direct. During a visit to London in 1966, she asked her mother bluntly whether she was eating, whether the travel schedule was sustainable, whether perhaps it was time to reduce commitments and rest. Edwina responded with the same careful deflection she had perfected over decades, assuring Patricia that she was fine, that the doctor had pronounced her healthy enough for her age, that the work was too important to abandon for minor physical complaints. Patricia did not push further. She had learned in childhood that pushing for emotional honesty from her mother resulted in nothing except reinforced distance. She returned to her own family worried but helpless, aware that her mother was deteriorating, but unable to intervene in any way that would be accepted. Pamela barely noticed. Her own life had become chaotic by 1966. Her marriage to David Hicks was failing visibly. She was drinking more than she admitted, and her mother's declining health was simply another problem she lacked the capacity to address. When they saw each other, which was rarely, Pamela performed cheerfulness and Edwina performed competence, and neither acknowledged that both performances were failing. The physical symptoms accumulated. Chronic digestive problems that made eating painful even when she attempted it. Insomnia that left her awake most nights despite the pills she took with increasing frequency. Joint pain severe enough that walking became difficult, which she ignored until it became impossible to hide the limp. Persistent cough that doctors suspected was tuberculosis until tests proved otherwise, though they could not identify what was actually causing it. She traveled through all of it. Southeast Asia in 1966, the Middle East in 1967, back to India in 1968, for the first time since Nehru's death. The India trip was particularly difficult. Everywhere she went reminded her of him, and the new government treated her with polite formality that made clear she was connected to a previous era that was no longer relevant. She visited refugee camps, toured medical facilities, and wrote reports that were received with less interest than they had been when Nehru was alive to ensure they received attention. The trip exhausted her to the point that she could not hide it. She cut it short by 2 weeks, returned to London, and spent a month in bed recovering from what doctors called viral infection, but was actually complete physical collapse from accumulated stress and malnutrition. Lewis was informed but did not visit. He was traveling himself, occupied with naval matters that he considered more pressing than an illness his wife had largely brought upon herself. Edwina recovered enough to resume limited activity by late 1968, but the recovery was incomplete. She moved more slowly, tired easily, and had difficulty concentrating for extended periods. Staff noticed that she repeated herself in conversations, forgot appointments she had made, and occasionally seemed confused about what day it was. The symptoms suggested either early dementia or severe exhaustion. Doctors could not determine which, and Edwina refused the extensive testing that might have clarified. Her 60th birthday in November 1961 had passed without celebration. She was traveling and had forbidden anyone to make arrangements. Her 65th birthday in November 1966 was similar, marked only by cards from family that she read and filed without comment. By 68, she had outlived most of her generation. Ernest Cassell's friends were all dead. Her father had died in 1939. The social circle that had dominated her youth had dispersed through death, divorce, or withdrawal from public life. She was surrounded by people, staff, officials from organizations she worked with, colleagues in relief work, but knew none of them in any intimate way. Her daughters were adults with families of their own, connected to her through legal relationship and trust fund disbursements, but not through affection or genuine knowledge. Lewis was a person she had been married to for nearly 50 years and had never really known. Nehru was dead. The loneliness that had defined her entire life was now complete, and there was no work urgent enough to continue disguising it. In early 1960, she accepted one final assignment, a tour of inspection for St. John ambulance facilities in the Far East. The trip would include stops in Singapore, Malaya, Borneo, and Hong Kong, lasting approximately 6 weeks. Her doctors advised against it. Her staff expressed concern. Patricia wrote asking her to reconsider. Edwina ignored all of them and boarded the flight in February. The heat in Jesselton, North Borneo, was worse than Edwina remembered from previous visits. She arrived in February 1960, stepping off the small aircraft onto a runway that shimmered in afternoon humidity, thick enough to make breathing feel like effort. She was 60 years old, 20 pounds underweight, and had slept poorly on 3 consecutive flights from London. The official welcoming committee noticed her unsteadiness, but said nothing. She was a countess, the wife of an earl, and one did not comment on the physical condition of visiting dignitaries, no matter how concerning it appeared. The inspection schedule was aggressive, even for someone in good health. 4 hospitals in 5 days, each requiring tours of facilities, meetings with local staff, detailed note-taking about equipment shortages and training needs. Edwina insisted on seeing everything: the surgical wards, the supply rooms, the staff quarters where nurses slept in conditions barely better than the patients they treated. She asked questions about sterilization procedures, about medication inventories, about why certain wards had patients sleeping two to a bed when the hospital was supposed to have adequate capacity. The local administrator, a British colonial officer named Henderson, followed her through the inspections, growing increasingly uncomfortable. The questions she asked had no good answers. The wards were overcrowded because the local population had increased, but funding had not. Medication was insufficient because supply chains were unreliable, and the colonial government considered medical supplies for natives a lower priority than maintaining infrastructure that served British economic interests. Sterilization procedures were inadequate because training was minimal, and staff turnover was high due to wages that barely supported survival. Henderson provided polite evasions. Edwina recorded them in her notebook alongside the actual conditions she observed. She had been conducting these inspections long enough to know that her reports would be filed carefully and acted upon minimally. But she wrote them anyway because not writing them would mean admitting the work was pointless, and admitting that would mean confronting what she had been avoiding for decades. On the third day, she fainted during a hospital tour. One moment she was standing in a crowded ward asking about patient intake procedures. The next, she was on the floor with nurses surrounding her and Henderson calling for water. She regained consciousness within seconds, insisted she was fine, refused to sit down, and continued the inspection. The nurses exchanged glances that Henderson pretended not to see. Visiting dignitaries collapsing during tours was not unprecedented, but Edwina's insistence on continuing after clearly being unwell was unusual enough to be worrying. That evening, Henderson suggested she rest the following day, perhaps tour only one facility instead of two. Edwina refused. The schedule had been arranged weeks in advance. Staff at multiple locations had prepared for her visits, and disrupting the plan because of momentary dizziness was unacceptable. Henderson did not argue. He increased the presence of medical staff during subsequent tours and ensured that chairs were available in every room she visited, whether the inspections required sitting or not. The fourth day proceeded without incident until late afternoon when Edwina began having difficulty speaking. She was mid-sentence, discussing inadequate ventilation in a tuberculosis ward when the words stopped arriving. She stood silent for several seconds, visibly struggling to continue, before the sentence completed itself and she moved on as if nothing had happened. The nurse she had been speaking to asked if she was all right. Edwina said she was tired and perhaps needed tea. Henderson arranged for tea in his office and insisted she sit for at least half an hour before proceeding. Edwina accepted the tea, drank it while reviewing her notes, and was standing to leave when her vision narrowed to a small bright point surrounded by darkness. She sat down again quickly enough that Henderson did not realize what had happened. The vision cleared after a few seconds. She finished her tea and completed the final inspection of the day. That night, alone in her room at the government residency, she allowed herself to acknowledge what was happening. The fainting, the difficulty speaking, the vision problems. These were not fatigue or minor illness. These were symptoms of something more serious, possibly a series of small strokes, possibly severe exhaustion that had progressed beyond what rest could repair. She should cancel the remainder of the tour. She should return to London and submit to the medical testing her doctors had been recommending for months. She decided instead to continue. The tour had 2 more weeks remaining. Canceling would mean admitting defeat, would mean returning to London with nothing to occupy her time, would mean sitting in her house thinking about Nehru's absence and the daughters who were strangers and the marriage that had never been real. Better to keep moving, keep working, keep performing the role of someone whose life had purpose, even if the purpose was increasingly difficult to sustain. The tour continued through Malaya, then Singapore. The inspections blurred together. Overcrowded wards, insufficient staff, inadequate equipment, polite administrators offering explanations that revealed systemic indifference to local suffering. Edwina wrote detailed reports knowing they would change nothing. She pushed through days that required more physical stamina than she possessed, sleeping poorly, eating minimally, consuming enough tea and cigarettes to create the illusion of energy. In Singapore, she stayed with friends, British expatriates who maintained colonial lifestyles in a country that was moving rapidly toward independence. They threw a small dinner party in her honor, invited local officials and medical personnel she had worked with on previous visits. Edwina sat through the dinner struggling to follow conversation, smiling at appropriate moments, contributing minimal replies when directly addressed. The hostess asked if she was feeling well. Edwina assured her everything was fine, just tired from travel. After dinner, she retired to her room and sat by the window looking out at the harbor. Ships moved in darkness, marked by lights that seemed too bright, too insistent. She thought about Nehru, about letters he had written describing exhaustion that felt permanent, about his warnings that she was working herself toward the same physical collapse that had killed him. She had ignored the warnings because stopping meant acknowledging that work was the only thing preventing her from confronting the emptiness underneath. The next morning, she attended a meeting with local St. John ambulance officials, discussed expansion plans for training programs, and committed funding from her personal accounts. The officials thanked her for her generosity and ongoing support. Edwina signed the necessary documents and returned to her hotel to prepare for the final leg of the tour. Hong Kong was scheduled for 5 days. She would inspect 3 facilities, attend 2 formal dinners, and meet with government officials about coordinating relief efforts for refugees from mainland China. The schedule was exhausting even conceptually. She reviewed it sitting in her hotel room, noted which events could potentially be shortened or combined, and decided she could manage it if she paced herself properly and accepted that she would need to rest between commitments. She never completed the Hong Kong portion of the tour. On February 21, 1960, while still in Singapore preparing for departure, Edwina Ashley Mountbatten suffered a massive stroke and died in her sleep. The news reached London through official channels before it reached family. The British High Commission in Singapore sent a coded telegram to the Foreign Office reporting the death of the Countess Mountbatten of Burma. The Foreign Office contacted the Admiralty. The Admiralty located Louis, who was attending a naval conference in Portsmouth. He received the information in a private office, thanked the messenger, and requested a secure line to contact his daughters. Patricia was at home in Kent when the call came. Louis delivered the information efficiently. Her mother had died in her sleep in Singapore. The cause appeared to be stroke or heart failure. Arrangements were being made to transport the body back to England for burial. Patricia asked if her mother had been in pain. Louis said he did not know, but assumed it had been quick. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Patricia sat afterward in her drawing room, holding the telephone receiver and realizing she felt primarily relief that her mother's restless motion had finally stopped. Pamela was harder to locate. She was staying with friends in the country, away from her husband, drinking through afternoons, and pretending her marriage was not disintegrating. When the call finally reached her late that evening, she was already drunk enough that the news felt distant and unreal. Her mother was dead. Her mother had always been distant and unavailable, and now the distance was permanent. Pamela thanked whoever had called, hung up, and poured another drink. The official statements were issued quickly. The Earl Mountbatten announced, with deep regret, the death of his wife, noting her dedicated service to relief work and her commitment to improving medical care in developing nations. The St. John Ambulance Brigade released a statement praising her years of leadership and her tireless efforts on behalf of the suffering. Newspapers ran obituaries that described her beauty, her wealth, her marriage to a man descended from royalty, and her transformation from society hostess to humanitarian worker. What the obituaries did not mention was that she had died alone, that her husband had not seen her in 3 months, that her daughters had been informed by telephone rather than in person, or that the relief work she had dedicated her final years to had been as much escape as purpose. The narrative that emerged was simpler and more palatable. A woman of privilege who had used her position to help others, whose life was an inspiration, whose death was a loss to humanitarian causes worldwide. The body was flown back to England and buried at Romsey Abbey near Broadlands, the estate Louis had inherited, and Edwina had stopped visiting years earlier. The funeral was well attended. Government officials, military personnel, representatives from organizations she had worked with, society figures who remembered her from decades of parties. Louis stood beside the grave in full naval uniform. Patricia and Pamela stood beside him, both wearing black, both composed. The service was Anglican, formal, and revealed nothing about who Edwina had actually been or what her life had cost her. Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, now a rising figure in Indian politics, sent a wreath and a letter expressing condolences that were formal enough to be appropriate and contained no reference to the relationship between Edwina and her father. The letters between Edwina and Nehru, hundreds of them written over 17 years, remained in Edwina's possession, carefully stored in locked boxes. Louis knew they existed but never asked to read them. Patricia knew they existed but did not request access. The letters stayed sealed for decades, private correspondence that would not be published until everyone directly involved was dead. The will was executed with the efficiency Ernest Cassell would have appreciated. Patricia received the largest share, properties, investments, trust funds that would ensure her children's financial security. Pamela received less, along with trusts structured to prevent her husband from accessing the principal. Louis received personal items and enough to maintain his lifestyle, though he hardly needed it, given his own fortune and pension. Staff received generous bequests. St. John Ambulance received a substantial endowment that would fund programs for years. The financial accounting was straightforward. The emotional accounting was impossible. Edwina had left behind wealth, properties, and organizations that would continue operating after her death. She had not left behind people who knew her, relationships that had been intimate rather than transactional, or evidence that her life had involved genuine connection to anyone beyond the singular relationship with Nehru that had existed largely through letters. Patricia sorted through her mother's belongings with the help of staff, deciding what to keep and what to distribute or discard. The clothing went to charity. Dozens of expensive gowns that had been worn once or never, suits tailored perfectly to a body that had wasted away, shoes in sizes that had decreased over the years as weight loss made even feet smaller. The jewelry was divided between Patricia and Pamela according to the will's instructions. Neither of them wanted most of it. The pieces were too elaborate, too connected to a lifestyle neither daughter had any interest in maintaining. The personal papers were more difficult. Edwina had kept meticulous records of her relief work, reports, correspondence with officials, detailed notes from hospital inspections. Patricia donated them to archives where researchers might eventually use them to document colonial medical history. The private correspondence was separated into categories: letters from family, letters from friends, letters from Nehru. The family letters revealed nothing except polite distance maintained across decades. The letters from friends were similarly superficial. The letters from Nehru were placed in storage, marked as restricted, and would remain sealed until the 1980s when Patricia finally authorized their release. Pamela took almost nothing from her mother's estate beyond what the will required her to receive. She did not want the jewelry, did not want the furniture, did not want reminders of a relationship that had never been real. She accepted the trust fund because refusing it would have been financially stupid, but she wanted no objects that would require her to remember a mother who had been absent even when physically present. The house Edwina had lived in after selling Brooke House was emptied within months. Louis did not want it. He maintained his own residence and had no use for another property filled with furniture he had never selected and belongings connected to a marriage that had ended emotionally decades before. It ended legally. The house was sold, the contents auctioned or distributed, and within a year there was almost no physical evidence that Edwina had lived there at all. Brooke House itself was already gone, demolished in 1933 and replaced by a hotel that bore no resemblance to the mansion Ernest Cassell had built to prove his arrival into English society. The hotel staff had no idea that the building they worked in occupied space where one of London's most elaborate private residences had once stood, where Edwina had thrown parties for hundreds, where she had performed the role of hostess with the same desperate intensity she later applied to relief work. The estates she had funded continued operating. Medical training programs in former colonies graduated nurses who had no idea their education had been financed by a woman who had inherited banking profits extracted from the same regions where they now worked. Relief organizations she had supported continued their work, citing her contributions in annual reports that reduced her to a name on donor lists alongside dozens of others. Within 5 years of her death, Edwina existed primarily as footnote in biographies of Louis, in histories of Indian independence that mentioned her relationship with Nehru, in organizational records of St. John Ambulance. The society columns that had once mentioned her constantly now mentioned her daughters and then her grandchildren, as the cycle of wealth and social position continued into another generation. Patricia raised her 7 children with more attention than she had received, though the pattern of emotional distance was harder to break than she had anticipated. She loved her children but struggled to express it, having never been shown what parental affection looked like when genuine. She ensured they were educated, supported, and financially secure. Whether they felt loved was harder to determine. Pamela divorced David Hicks in 1975, 15 years after her mother's death. The divorce was bitter, expensive, and publicly documented in ways that would have horrified Edwina. Pamela spent the following decade drinking too much, traveling aimlessly, and repeating her mother's pattern of filling emptiness with motion that arrived nowhere meaningful. She eventually stopped drinking, found modest contentment in quieter life, but never fully recovered from a childhood spent learning that she was not important enough to deserve her mother's attention. Louis Mountbatten lived another 19 years after Edwina's death, accumulating honors and appointments that would have gratified the ambitious young officer who had married for money in 1922. He was promoted to Admiral of the Fleet, served as Chief of the Defense Staff, collected titles and ceremonial positions with the methodical focus he had applied to his entire career. He remarried briefly in his 70s, then lived alone at Broadlands, surrounded by staff and visited occasionally by family, who treated him with the polite deference his rank required. He rarely spoke about Edwina, except when asked directly, and then only in terms that emphasized her relief work and humanitarian efforts. The personal aspects of their marriage, the separate bedrooms, the decades of mutual infidelity, the relationship that had been transaction from the beginning, he never discussed publicly. Whether he thought about them privately was unknowable. He kept no diary that revealed interior life, wrote no letters that exposed doubt or regret, and maintained until his death in 1979 the careful public performance that had characterized his entire existence. The manner of his death was more violent than Edwina's and carried different ironies. He was killed by an IRA bomb while on holiday in Ireland, or blown apart on his fishing boat along with several family members, including one of Patricia's sons. The targeting was deliberate. He was a symbol of British imperialism, a representative of the establishment that had governed Ireland for centuries. His death was meant to send a message about the costs of empire, about violence returning to those who had exported it to colonies, about the impossibility of escaping history, even in retirement. The funeral was state occasion, military honors, royal attendance, ceremonies that positioned him as hero and servant of nation. The coverage treated his death as tragedy without examining what he had actually done during his career, what compromises he had made, what violence had been committed under his authority during the partition of India and subsequent colonial emergencies. He was mourned as if his service had been purely noble, as if the empire he had represented had been something other than extraction and exploitation conducted through administrative efficiency. Patricia inherited Broadlands and the remaining Mountbatten fortune. She maintained the estate, preserved her father's papers, and eventually authorized publication of materials that revealed more about the family than Louis would have permitted during his lifetime. The letters between Edwina and Nehru were finally released in the 1980s, generating brief renewed interest in a relationship that had ended 2 decades earlier. Historians analyze the letters for insights into the end of empire, into the personal costs of public life, into how intimacy functions when conducted primarily through written correspondence. What the letters revealed was not scandal, but sadness. 2 lonely people finding temporary relief from isolation through written conversation, sharing vulnerabilities they could express to no one else, building a relationship that was genuine despite existing primarily on paper. The letters were published, discussed briefly, and then faded from public attention except among specialists studying the period. The relationship that had meant everything to both Edwina and Nehru became historical footnote, interesting detail in larger narratives about Indian independence and British imperial decline. The wealth Edwina had inherited continued circulating through generations. Patricia's children inherited portions, then their children inherited portions, the money dividing and multiplying through investment and careful management. Ernest Cassell's original fortune had been built on lending money to governments and corporations engaged in colonial extraction. That fortune had purchased Edwina's marriage to Louis, had funded her parties and her relief work, and now funded the comfortable lives of descendants who had never met Ernest Cassell and had only vague understanding of where the money had originated. None of Patricia's grandchildren worked in the sense that work was economically necessary. They pursued careers in art, in charity work, in business ventures that were hobbies made possible by trust fund income. They were educated at expensive schools, lived in expensive neighborhoods, and moved through the world with the easy confidence that comes from never having questioned whether basic needs will be met. The pattern Ernest Cassell had initiated in the 1880s, converting labor extraction into financial instruments into inherited wealth, had successfully reproduced itself across 4 generations. The organizations Edwina had supported continued operating with reduced acknowledgement of her contributions. St. John Ambulance still existed, training medical volunteers and providing emergency services, but the plaques mentioning her name were removed during building renovations, or simply forgotten as staff turned over and institutional memory faded. The medical facilities she had funded in former colonies were nationalized after independence, renamed, and eventually closed or replaced as new governments established their own healthcare systems. Her relief work, examined in retrospect, looked less impressive than the obituaries had suggested. She had documented suffering without addressing its causes, had funded programs that alleviated immediate crisis without challenging the structures that produced ongoing exploitation, and had used humanitarian work to escape from psychological emptiness rather than from genuine commitment to systemic change. This was not unique to her. Most colonial-era charity followed similar patterns, but it meant her legacy was more complicated than the simple narrative of a wealthy woman helping the less fortunate. The houses she had lived in were gone or transformed beyond recognition. Brooke House was a hotel where guests slept in rooms that occupied space where she had once hosted parties for hundreds. The house in Singapore where she died was demolished and replaced by modern high-rise. Broadlands remained but was open to public tours, the private residence converted into heritage attraction, where visitors paid admission to walk through rooms that had once been family spaces. Her personal possessions dispersed through auction and inheritance until almost nothing remained that she had actually touched or selected. A few pieces of jewelry stayed in the family, worn occasionally by granddaughters who knew they had belonged to Edwina but knew almost nothing about who she had been. Some furniture appeared in auction catalogs sold to collectors interested in period pieces rather than personal history. The clothing, the letters to friends, the daily objects that accumulate during a lifetime, all of it was discarded or donated or destroyed. The photographs remained, published in books about the era, used in documentaries about the end of empire, archived in collections documenting British aristocratic life in the 20th century. The images showed a beautiful woman in expensive clothing at formal events, smiling in ways that revealed nothing about what she was thinking. Without caption, the photographs could have been of anyone from that class and period. The wealth and formality made individuals interchangeable, reduced them to types rather than specific persons. Patricia died in 2017 at age 93, having outlived both her parents by decades and having maintained the family position through careful management and appropriate marriages for her children. Her obituaries mentioned her lineage, daughter of Edwina Ashley and Louis Mountbatten, descendant of European royalty, heiress to banking fortune. They mentioned her own accomplishments, her family, her role in preserving Broadlands as heritage site. They did not mention what it had been like to be raised by staff while her mother traveled constantly, or whether she had ever forgiven Edwina for choosing relief work over relationship with her daughters. Pamela died in 2017 as well, 2 months after her sister, having lived a quieter life that attracted less attention and left smaller legacy. Her obituaries were brief, noting her parentage and her failed marriage, but little else. She had not maintained the social position her birth should have guaranteed, had not produced children to carry the lineage forward, and had not accumulated the kind of accomplishments that generate lengthy posthumous assessment. She had simply lived and then stopped living, leaving behind minimal evidence that she had existed at all. The grandchildren who inherited portions of Ernest Cassell's fortune mostly did not know his name or understand how the money had been made. When asked about family history, they mentioned Louis Mountbatten and his role in Indian independence, mentioned Edwina's relief work, and sometimes mentioned the connection to European royalty. They did not mention that the entire structure of their lives rested on profits extracted from colonial labor, or that their comfort was built on systems designed to prevent most people from ever achieving similar security. In the National Portrait Gallery in London, there's a photograph of Edwina Mountbatten, taken in 1932. She is 28 years old, wearing pearls that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, looking directly at the camera with an expression that could be confidence or could be careful performance of confidence. The photograph hangs in a corridor between more famous subjects, and most visitors walk past it without stopping. The inscription identifies her as Countess Mountbatten of Burma, notes her humanitarian work, mentions her role during the last days of British India. It does not mention that she was desperately unhappy for most of her life, or that she filled the unhappiness with motion that arrived nowhere, or that the relief work the inscription praises was as much escape as service. These things are difficult to convey in museum text. Her great-grandchildren exist somewhere, living on portions of a fortune that has divided and multiplied across generations, connected to her through legal documents and DNA, but not through memory or knowledge. They carry her genes and her money, and almost nothing else of her. Whether this constitutes legacy or simply biological and financial continuation is unclear. The letters she wrote to Nehru sit in archives, occasionally consulted by historians writing about the period, read by scholars interested in how personal relationships intersect with political transitions. The letters reveal loneliness, intelligence, vulnerability she showed to almost no one else. They do not reveal whether the relationship gave her what she needed or simply made the absence of what she needed more visible. Brooke House is gone. The parties are forgotten. The guests who filled her drawing rooms are dead. The suffering she documented in refugee camps has been replaced by different suffering in different camps. The system that produced her grandfather's fortune continues producing fortunes through similar mechanisms with different names. What remains is a question that was never answered. Whether she understood, in those final moments in Singapore, that she had spent 60 years running from something that was inside her, and therefore could never be escaped. The stroke that killed her was sudden. Probably she had no time for final recognition. Probably she died still moving.